Last time I went on and on about how important it was for a judge to be disinterested, not personally involved, to be a judge, not an advocate, to be somebody who weighs things on a big picture, justice oriented scale, not on the scale of political advantage or ideological purity. And I said, our system needs that. However, despite that, there are now two distinct branches of thought regarding justice and the courts. And of course, these branches of thought reflect the almost poisonous opposition between progressive, liberal, socialist, left wing oriented people on the one hand, and conservative, libertarian oriented people on the other hand. And like so many other things in our lovely republic these days, the poison between these two sides is making it more and more and more difficult for them to do their jobs the way the system is intended. If you detect a slight frustration, you're picking up on the truth. I'm frustrated. I think anyone who looks at this and sees that the court system, which should be the least political part of our government, has become so politicized, would be frustrated. Okay, let's look at the two sides. Judicial activism for a living constitution. What the people who espouse judicial activism say is that the courts must do what politicians won't for the country. If the politicians are stymied by a Neanderthal political opinion that prevents them from bravely improving the ills of society and courageously, as visionaries, righting the wrongs of society, if politicians can't do it, judges must step forward and do it. Already you see the difference, I hope, in the attitude that judges are going to do what the elected officials are afraid to do because it's right. And this idea, this attitude, includes the Constitution. The idea that an 18th century document written in part by dead European white men, some of whom were slave owners. No, not in this woke 21st century era that we live in. No, that cannot limit our sense of justice. This approach, the judicial activism, says that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. Now, in literal terms, they're not wrong. That's what the amendment system is for. The amendment system allows the Constitution to be altered and tweaked, and the Constitutional Convention system would allow an entirely new Constitution to be written if the consensus of public opinion in this country became convinced that the Constitution no longer worked. But that is not what my friends and fellow citizens who are believers in judicial activism mean when they say living Constitution. What they mean is that they arrogate unto themselves the right to decide and reinterpret the words in the Constitution, in the Federalist Papers, and in the other documents that explain the Founding Fathers' vision for this country. To adapt all of that old dead European white men stuff to the modern sensibilities that they epitomize. Now, I remind you, full disclosure, I am personally a conservative individual who really has a problem with judicial activism. But allow me to explain how judicial activism has helped this country and some controversies. After the American Civil War, the federal government of the United States had won, but it was faced with the problem: what do you do with free people who, if given free rein, would basically reimpose slavery in the southern states? At first, during the first 10 years after the Civil War, roughly 1865 to close to 1875, in the period known as Reconstruction, the federal government under radical Republicans went south and ruled the southern states like a bunch of colonies and established a whole new way of doing things designed to limit the power of southern whites over southern blacks. But when self-government was restored to the South, they couldn't overtly return to slavery. That's what the Civil War was about, and they knew that. But what they could do is start tweaking things so that blacks would become second-class citizens. And that's what they did. And this system, as we know, is Jim Crow. The Jim Crow system of laws effectively stripped blacks of their rights to vote, to assemble, to petition their government, to act as representatives within their government. Blacks became second-class citizens in every way you can think. That is what they did with their freedom in the South. They built a system of Jim Crow. And under that system, every politician was elected. And because those politicians were elected under the Jim Crow system by the Southern whites, they were not susceptible to electoral pressures from blacks or from more liberal elements in their society. They were Democrats, by the way. This is a historical fact. The party of slavery in the North and in the South before the Civil War was the Democratic Party. The party of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War was the Democratic Party right up through the 1960s, right up through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because of this, there was precious little possibility that the state governments in these southern states that were Jim Crow were ever going to reform themselves. So a series of judicial gambits were played by Thurgood Marshall, an African-American lawyer who became the first black Supreme Court justice. This is long before he became that. Thurgood Marshall and the Southern Poverty Law Center made a series of test cases in the courts testing detailed elements of Jim Crow. And these court decisions were appealed high enough to reach the federal court system that was a little bit beyond the control of the Southern politicians. Some of them even reached the United States Supreme Court at a time when former governor of California, Republican Earl Warren, was leading a very activist court. Goes to show you, it's not just Democrats that are judicial advocates. Liberal Republicans are also, like Earl Warren. And these Supreme Court decisions, in part, dismantled Jim Crow. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, again and again, in education and voting rights and in other areas, the Jim Crow system was revealed to be unconstitutional and un-American, and it was rejected in appeal. Without the judicial activities of Thurgood Marshall and the Southern Poverty Law Center, and without the willingness to be judicially active on the part of federal appeals court judges and the United States Supreme Court, without that, we would not have gotten to the crisis that brought us the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the end of legal discrimination in this country. In that case, judicial activists saved us from a huge burden of collective shame and sin, if you want to call it that, that says we fight our bloodiest war in part to free the slaves, and we do, but not really because of Jim Crow. Well, finally in the 1960s, that's dealt with. And the judicial activism of the Warren Court was a big part of that. So I am admitting a case, and you can find others, where judicial activists did things for the country in the best interests of the Constitution, they said, that actually, I think most objective people would admit, were good things, and probably could not have been done through the normal political process. But there are limits. Probably the most divisive United States Supreme Court decision in the last 100 years has been the Roe versus Wade decision of 1973, I think. Early 1970s, definitely. I think 1973. Because the Roe v. Wade decision, on a federal level, in effect, legalized abortion, which is the termination of life within the womb, which may be human life, depending upon your theological and philosophical point of view, but which certainly, if left alone, would probably become a human being. Abortions had been practiced since before there were towns, cities, and farms. People knew that there were herbs that a woman could take that would probably cause her to have a miscarriage. And in most of our history, abortions were considered to be horrific, absolutely evil, and illegal. But like gambling or prostitution or any of the other things that people do because they feel a need to do them, and I'm not comparing abortion to recreations like gambling or prostitution, but people are going to do what people are going to do, especially in a so-called free society. However, by going to back alley doctors, a woman seeking an illegal abortion was taking her life into her hands because the doctor was probably not one of the best. And yeah, deciding that terminating a pregnancy should be the choice of the woman involved or the people involved is the sort of thing that self-evidently should have been decided by politicians in something similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But that isn't what happened. The judicial activists invented something called the right to privacy, which was used as a justification, you'll find it nowhere in the Constitution, for the decision in Roe v. Wade, which through the back door permits legal abortions in the United States. Whether you are for or against legal abortion, having a court decision make a decision so big and not having the politicians or the political process or anyone else who's accountable to the electorate vote on something like that would be like a court decision legalizing cannibalism or incest or certain types of ritual murder. It is the sort of thing that is such a game changer for our culture that having a court decision do it truly drives some people absolutely crazy, because it didn't happen through the legitimate political process. It happened through the back door of a Supreme Court decision that was an example of judicial activism. The supporters say the justices on the court did what politicians couldn't do because they're so afraid, and they made the world a better place. Other people say what you did is you changed the fundamental nature of the United States and the relationship between the people and the government by legalizing something that many believe is murder. So, judicial activism.